And you're welcome back. Today is Africa Day, and Pan-African agency Brands Africa says it is alarmed at the sharp decline in the patronage and appreciation of products manufactured on the African continent as compared to those of imported origin. The group today released its 13th list of most admired brands in Africa based on a survey conducted in 32 African countries that account for more than 85% of the continent's GDP and population. Key highlights from the document point out that despite the optimism with the progress of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement and other initiatives to drive African progress, African brands regressed to some 20% from a 10-year high of 17% to 14% share of the top 100 almost admired brands in Africa. Let's bring in my colleague Michael Niashali, who's been monitoring details of this latest research released by Brands Africa. Papani, why are African brands not being patronized by Africans themselves?
Well, that is not something directly that this survey actually points out. What we have is actually what the questions you had asked the people and what responses they had given at the end of the day. So if you take, for instance, the most admired brands, top 100 on the African continent, you have three companies, the top three, USA, Germany, and South Korea, having their brands in there, but not African countries. You have in some other areas, even in NGO, where you're having entities that are doing charity work. It is not starting from, you're having countries like USA, and again Switzerland in the first three positions, except in situations where the questions are prompted or the people that we're expecting to give us the answers are prompted. That is when they come up with African names. So you see, for instance, most admired brands, top 100, you have Nike, Adidas, and Samsung, or USA, Germany, South Korea, respectively. But when they are prompted, they ask most admired brands on the African continent. That is when you have Nigeria and South African companies coming in. So it points to the fact of what the fact is that 14% of African shares in terms of brands are what are admired on the African continent. Largely, you are getting most of these brands coming from outside the continent. And that is what most people are consuming, be it in the consumables, be it in the media space. And you find that even in the media space, that is the only place in this document that tells you that, well, without being prompted or without being led, Africans choose a particular brand, that is DSTV, over some other channels. But even from there, the second and third positions are from non-African brands.
So it appears that this is a bigger problem the continent is facing. How about African brands at least making some strides in spite of this tough market penetration, if we can talk about it that way?
Yes, and so even for that, you have two African countries taking up the majority, that is Nigeria and then South Africa, most often than not. And once in a while, you find Zambia, Ethiopia, and some other countries. But to talk about African brands that are getting this, enjoying some bit of good acceptance from Africans, you have Nigeria's Dangote. Usually, it's most of these prompts that you have seen, the answers, the people's choice. He's in there. And again, you find MTN and then DSTV. And then when you come to some other areas like the banking sector, you have South Africa's Standard Bank and then Kenya's Equity Bank, and then South Africa again with Absa Bank. So again, it tells you the dominance of even South Africa and Nigeria on the continent in terms of what Africans consume alike. Well, except in the airline space where you find Ethiopia with Ethiopian Airlines, and then that really is it for Africa. When it comes to consumables, Coca-Cola tops in it. Coca-Cola is not an African origin, it's of USA origin.
Amazing findings there. Not too pleased about it, particularly when you don't find any Ghanaian brand in there. Michael Niashali, my colleague in the Joy Newsroom, thank you for bringing us up to speed with this. In fact, today is marking the African Day, and the African continent is dedicating that to the Continental Free Trade Area. The Secretary General, Wamkele Mene, earlier today underscored this view that now is the right moment for African leaders to take another leap towards the continent's integration by substituting these imported goods for African products. He was speaking at an event where President Akufo-Addo also participated in a dialogue on how to improve participation in the Continental Free Trade Area.
In terms of international trade, the continent is highly dependent on extra African sources of imports of food and agricultural products. Clearly, there is no reason for our continent to be a net food importer. Africa holds at least 1/6 of global plant species, with many crops of African origin, species of wheat, barley, maize meal, sorghum, 65% of the world's arable land, and 30% of mineral deposits are here in our continent. Therefore, it is possible for our continent to be self-sufficient, to provide food for herself, and to unlock opportunities, job opportunities for young Africans in the area of agriculture and agro-processing. Therefore, there is an imperative for us to accelerate trade in agricultural products, basic agricultural products, to enable our communities, the rural communities, smallholder farmers, to be part of the value chain of agricultural products trade in Africa. This is why the African Continental Free Trade Area is so critical. It positions our continent to take advantage of the resources that we have, to create jobs, to enable smallholder farmers to be part of trade in Africa.
And we still have that big question, how do we show up the support for the Continental Free Trade Area when Africans themselves are not patronizing what we produce? I want to bring in two gentlemen. Tebe Ikalefeng is the chairperson of Brands Africa, those who carried out the research, and Yao Louise Affle is executive director for the African Continental Free Trade Area Policy Network. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us here on Africa Day, where we're, of course, dedicating the day to the Continental Free Trade Area. Not a good start, Thebe, in terms of the findings that we're having, that Africans are not patronizing what we have. So what's the assurance that the Continental Free Trade Area will succeed? Thebe, if you can hear me, I'm just asking what the assurance is that indeed we will succeed with the Continental Free Trade Area when Africans themselves are not admiring the brands that we have.
A very good question, and indeed, until we get to a point where as Africans we are consuming African brands, then we are not going to be able to achieve the big goal of AFCFTA or any other major initiative that we're trying to drive. So I agree entirely with you that we have a problem, we have a challenge, and we need to keep building on. We need to fix the problem as Africans. And I think I've looked at it in three areas. And the one area that we need to fix, we need to invest in research. If you look at Africans, how we in the whole continent, we only spend less than 1% of our GDP on research. So if we are not spending money on research, it means we are not innovating. The second one, I look at the area of intellectual property. When it comes to intellectual property, less than 2% of the global trademarks that are registered worldwide are from Africa. And when you look at a country like China and America, they're in their 20s. So, and those are the countries which are leading in terms of coming up with new products and new initiatives. The third area is the area of pride. What we need to do is we need to transform pride into products and profits. And the problem with us as Africans is we're very proud to be African. We're very proud to tell people we're from Africa, but we don't express that through our pockets.
The point about colonial vestige, that's the belief of some as to what we're seeing. The fact that, well, I don't want to mention the name of the brands, but you know them quite well, having been there for far too long, and they've dominated the market simply because we did not have the capacity at the time to produce some of these products on the market. Could the problem not be coming from that side? The lack of appreciation for similar goods being produced in Africa when they're facing stiff opposition from those who have dominated the market for long?
But we've been around for 60 years now as a democracy, and I'll talk about sub-Saharan Africa. Let's look at Ghana, 6 March 1957. Yes. So it's 60 years. What we need to do as Africans, We need to stop begging, we need to stop borrowing, and we need to stop blaming. We need to take the initiative by the scruff of its neck and create those products that are going to help build the continent. If you look at listen to what His Excellency Wamkele Mene just spoke about earlier as well. The big job of AfCFTA is to open up the markets, is to enable Africans to trade with Africans. If you look at intra-Africa trade, it's only 15 to 18%, and the big goal is by 2030 to be at 50%. We are never going to achieve that if we are not creating, consuming, and supporting local brands. And what we need to do, we need to aim at the idea of ensuring that the goods and services which are moving indeed across the continent are goods that come from Africa. And if we don't do that, if we don't give African goods an advantage over imports and all those, we will remain behind all the other business, all the other countries.
Okay.
So we need to be a bit selfish as Africans.
I'll come to Louis shortly, but the question as to why African brands don't sell, the question about packaging and why we're not penetrating into other markets, do you feel that's where the problem is coming from?
I mean, let's look at the different brands that we have already in African brands. You look at Dangote, an incredibly well-packaged brand. From petroleum to flowers to cement. So we have the capacity and ability, and Dangote has proven it. You look at MTN from telecommunications, we've proven that. You look at Safaricom from Kenya, we've proven that. We've looked at Ethiopian Airlines in Ethiopia, we've proven that. You look at Ghana itself with Casaprego, which is in the top 100 brands this year again, as it was for the last couple of years. We have the ability to do that. But what we need to do, we need to be consistent in how we deliver on excellence. But we also need to, as African consumers, we need to insist that those businesses and products that we buy and support are also held up to the same high standard that we expect of non-African brands. You remember us as Africans, we would go to London, we'll go to America, go to Italy, and we will insist on the very finest. But when we come back home, we don't insist and invest in the same excellence. Instead, we'll take our money and go buy a house in Chelsea in London. We are in the UK. We'll take our money and we move to America. But when we come home, we live in slums and we live in and we're prepared to drive in bad roads, and we're prepared to take and we will then ignore the products that are of lesser quality. As Africans, we need to put a higher standard on ourselves, and we need to insist that we served and we are consuming the same products of the same level, because that's only then we are going to displace the international brands.
And there's a need for us to learn lessons from some of the brands making it. But Yao Louis Afful, through the African Continental Free Trade Policy Network, you've been able to provide some strategic partnerships and technical advice to the Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat here in Accra. But how come that you're not supporting the private sector? Where are we falling short?
I would like to say good afternoon to your viewers and also to my co-panelists. I think that it's been a great research or survey that they've done. When I sometimes look back, when I pioneered the AfCFTA advocacy, it's way back 2017. At the time, I didn't see any company, any private sector, any CSO, even the Secretariat itself, really pushing what the benefit of the AfCFTA was about. I look back and sometimes I cry, because at this point, I still feel that the understanding of the concept of this agreement far-fetched. The kind of surveys that my colleague, co-panelist, is presenting, those are the kind of messages that we need to explain from the agreement to the people. And I give an example. I did a comparative study on the export and import comparativity of all the 54 African countries. Why? How can you export a product to a country where you don't know the needs of that country? How can you import from a country when you don't know what they are good at? So product identification was key. When you're able to know your product identification, then you move to the next stage in terms of what goes into the production. Then you, as my colleague said, you now look at the quality assurance. That's where standardization and certification comes in. This is very, very, very important, and it cuts across both goods and services. The private sector, we are just carrying the message, oh, let's export, we can trade among each other, we can trade. But what are you going to trade? What is it that you want to trade? What is it that you want to trade? And I take, if you take this ASEFTA, we have services, which makes about 50% of the GDP of African economies. If you take tourism, and just take tourism, and I was happy you mentioned when you go outside Africa, you always want quality. When you take tourism, tourism has been negotiated, so it's good to go. We are ready to go pay for with hard currencies outside Africa when it comes to tourism, destinations, travels, and whatever.
Right.
If you take Ghana, the center of the earth passes through Tema, but we don't own the GMT 0.00. It is UK which is taking it away from us. But the center, the line, equator passes through Tema. Go there and see if there's any service, any product, any building, any edifice to show that this is product we have.
And since you're bringing it, just land on that point for me, yes.
If we were having an edifice, a project edifice, a tourism edifice of products at the center of the earth in Tema, you could imagine the kind of tourists that will come here to patronize that service. We don't care about that brand because we have not even put anything there. We don't believe that when we set up the center of the earth edifice or town or city, anybody will take us for granted. But let the same center of the earth be located in Dubai. We will pay hard currencies to attend. Right. Even in Nigeria, Nigerians have we call it there is a park in Nigeria where you have this electric cars, the Valley. Most Nigerians even don't have knowledge of it, let alone to patronize it. So
and that's a crucial point you're raising about even awareness. And in fact, Toby has some background in the tourism space, where, of course, he served extensively. And Toby, the point that Yao has been raising about even awareness, the private sector, being conscious of some of the opportunities around, how can we leverage on that to market African brands?
Well, I think what we need to do first, we need to invest even in the entrepreneurs in the continent. We need to help to build the capacity of African entrepreneurs to be able to rise to the level that we want them to compete. And I think the examples made about tourism are also quite important. I mean, as you know, I spent 10 years and I was deputy chairperson of tourism for South Africa. And we know that that's a low-hanging fruit from an African continent. It's an easy one to try to transform into a true African experience because nobody else can offer the world what we have. In terms of tourism, in terms of the authenticity, and as well as the quality of the tourism product. But where we fail again is in how we package those opportunities, how we package that. I mean, if you look at a country like Seychelles, which is 100,000 people only, and they get about 60 to 70% of their receipts from tourism. So you would say, if you understand, as a point that we made earlier, your customers, you understand where they come from. Now you'll be able to transform that. So about 2013, at the 50th anniversary of African Union, I was asked by New African to write an article to reflect on the brands in the continent. One of the interviews that I did was with Samsung, and I met KK Park, who was responsible for Africa and Middle East. And I said to him, KK, why are you so successful in the continent? He says, my friend, I'm successful. We are successful in the continent. We have taken out the brands like Nokia and all those because he himself, he said, me, myself, and most of my people, my team, have been to every other African country. And he says, because of that experience, we were able to look at Africa, to look at the opportunities that it presents. Because us Africans, when there's no electricity, when there's doomso, or there's load shedding, as we call it here, and there's we look at it and says, oh, our countries are so backward. He says, we didn't look at them that way. He said, they look at doomso, and they said, well, here is an opportunity to use the one natural resource that Africa has got, which is the sun, and take that and create products which are solar-based and to serve African consumers. So us as Africans, we always sidestep the opportunities which we are facing, which opportunities are facing us in our eyes. Because what we try and do, we first try to become Italian or better than the Italians at selling Italy, better than the English at selling English, instead of looking at the one competitive advantage we have, which is our innate understanding and authentic relationship with the rest of the country.
And I'm just taking a look at some of the brands still thriving in spite of all of these challenges. You have the likes of Dangote Group, DSTV, MTN Group. What lessons are there to learn from these brands that are at least trying to make the strides for other emerging brands within Africa to take advantage of?
You know, I think I'm excited because I've been to every single country in the continent, and because I've been to every single country in the continent, I've been able to observe some of the questions that you're referring to in terms of what makes a Dangote successful, what makes an MTN successful. Now, if you go to Nigeria, for example, and you go to the marketplaces and you see where they're selling Dangote, some of them will have a picture of a Dangote there. But the most important thing is that there's a relatability. When I saw that picture, I said, oh, so that speaks to the relatability. They can relate to the person, they can relate to the product, because they did not go and name it some Italian name to try and attract Nigerians. They named it after Dangote, using his name, which is a local name that everybody can relate to. So what's important for us as Africans is the relatability part. And the second one is the accessibility. If you look at a brand like MTN, for example, which 30 years ago created the ability to pay as you go, to use small amounts of money to get data. So it's an understanding that part of ensuring that there's accessibility to your product is you need to deliver it you need to deliver it in a way that African consumers can access it, whether it's at the smallest amount. The third one is if you look at, and I'll use an international brand, and I'll use Ghana as an example. So if you look at Coke, the Share campaign that Coke did at Ghana about 10 or so many years ago, you probably remember that campaign, and they showed the day names and the people and explaining the day names. So there was a relatability in the Ghanaian market in terms of, oh, this brand Coca-Cola, it understands me. It speaks my language. It understands my culture. So there was a relatability. There was an accessibility by the MTNs, and there was a recognition of in the Dangote space. To me, that's what it is. And most importantly is what those brands have also done well. The Dangotes, the Nike, the Dangotes, the MTNs, the Safaricoms, and the Ethiopian telecoms. What they've done well is they have packaged their brands in a way that is as competitive. They have innovated in terms of the products that they deliver, and they sell in a way that respects their customers.
Okay. Luis, you are heavy on standards. I'm also concerned about pricing. How do you marry the two?
Again?
The issue about standards, I'm also concerned about prices, because sometimes these products that are coming from elsewhere are quite relatively cheaper than the African brands themselves.
Yes. Basically, I think that if we harmonize standardization and certification, then it will enable us to have a very strategic pricing for product registration. That is very important. And I think that is what is going to be done with ASU, the African, ASU, that is a body that is looking at harmonizing that. Secondly, we need to be able to look at the value chain and what goes into the transformative stages of our products. It's very, very important. For example, there are a lot of production processes that we don't need to import inputs from outside Africa. We can Africanize our product with the resources that we have here. A key example, if we take the Golden Tree chocolates, the Golden Tree chocolates has the purest bean capacity or level for 80% of cocoa. If you look at the other chocolates, sometimes that is outside the US, wherever it is, or other countries, is mostly powder and sugar. They really prefer our golden tree to what they have over there. But you go to our supermarkets and you see more of these chocolates than the golden tree. Why? Then he said that the price here is too expensive. Why is it so? We then have to go back to the drawing board and find out from the cocoa processing company, why is it that your pricing is too high? What is it that you need that you cannot have it here that is making your output so high? That is where then ASCFTA comes in. The ASCFTA comes in that whilst you are doing intra-trade, you look at where your comparative strength is. If you know that maybe labor is expensive here and your neighboring country can offer you the expertise, you do that kind of comparative exchange. So I think apart from standardization and certification, we also have to look into the transformative stages of our raw materials that would determine the prices, ex-factory prices that will attach our goods and our services. This is very, very, very important.
And if you take a look at the framework itself, the African Continental Free Trade Area, it seems to some that we appear not to be ready. We're still running the guided trade initiative, and many are wondering when it will be time for full takeoff.
Let me just tease you and myself.
Right.
If among the three of us now, my good friend, is it Tabo Fen?
Yes, Tebe.
Yes, he is in an African way. You are not in an African way. Even though today is African Union Day, you are not in an African way. The two of us. So we are already not patronizing. That is the first to start with. So it translates into why most people are not even ready under ASCFTA. Yes, because one, we were quick to sign something, but the implementation process is totally different. So if ASCFTA is delaying, then it has to do with the fact that our implementation strategy was totally different from our policy strategy. We need to merge the two. Secondly, there is a delink between policy level at the top and the people on the ground. Because what is at the top needs to trickle down to the ground for the ground to really process. But there's a total delink. There's a gap which needs to be filled. That is very, very important. Because if you are talking about intra-trade, I don't know the products and the needs of the country I'm supposed to trade with. Why will Ghana say import wheat from Iran when I know Nigeria can really produce that wheat in tons? Why would Nigeria go and import salt from Brazil when Ghana has so much salt? That is the kind of implementation that gap needs to be filled. Other than that, we will only be paying for workshops. And then the sad thing is that most of these institutions or grants or whatever coming out, I always say that they don't seem to understand the ASCFTA, or they are just don't be naive in supporting the implementation of the ASCFTA. And I give you an example. Most of these fund organizations who are here in Africa always are ready to give out money for workshops, capacity building, training. They are not interested in giving us the money to set up the factories, to set up the industries that can really connect to the value additions or the products we have here. And that is what we need from them. We don't need a workshop. The workshops are okay. Because once we go down to the people, they will understand. Set up the factory. The money they have, give it to us to set up the factory. That is when we become ready. Until we put factors of production into good use, we will continue to become talk shop. 3 years into trading now, can you tell me how many even of the customs within Africa have decoded their single windows and said this is an after product? This is an after product. They don't know.
I see. But then this will certainly create challenges for businesses. And beyond that as well, it's also raising and bringing back the arguments that were made at the start of takeoff in terms of ratification for the agreement itself. Tebe, I recall Eritrea making that strong case that let's build the REX, let's build the regional economic communities, have stronger brands there, stronger communities there before the takeoff of the Continental Free Trade Area. So we got it wrong from the start?
Well, it's 50-50 because it's a good question. The edge is good. We have started well. But I was making a point this morning, and I said elsewhere, I think that when the ASCFTA was adopted, the technical team that led to the phase one should have been maintained and left at the African Union Commission to focus on the phase two and phase three. But I think that the autonomy of the Secretariat was too fast.
Right.
Because you needed time to let those teams fully finish, because that they take time, go around the countries, negotiate, take their time, look at the nays and yeas, so that the Secretariat that focus on the phase one, and that, but the Secretariat said, no, let's move all the offices into Accra. And at the time, you were struggling with what do you call it, recruitment issues, with technical, with resources or resource people. That was one. Secondly, the parties that negotiated, they brought their schedules, they brought their concessions, but the key element that was missing was this. Were there legislative instruments backing the schedules and things that they brought forward? Is one thing saying, I'm ready to liberalize this, and it's another thing showing that you have legislations in place. I once had a conversation with the Secretary General, and he said, I'm frustrated. And I said, are you sure? He said, the frustration is this, look, I have done what I have to do by being a referee.
Okay.
But when you get down to the countries, especially the customs or the ports, legislations to really enforce whatever has been agreed to is.
For the sake of time, we need to go. So we'll have this conversation again. But Tebe, let me give you the final word as we wrap up. Yes, there are a few challenges where we're going to in terms of takeoff, because we're still running the guided trade initiative, as of course Yao Louisa was talking about. But we have some brands still stronger to pull others up, and some individuals as well. For instance, yourself being part of the 100 most influential on the continent. How do we gather and harness the energy so we're able to at least give a further boost to Continental Free Trade Area in spite of the challenges we're facing?
I think it starts with what Fela Kuti once said. He says you must identify with Africa, then you'll have an identity. So we need to appreciate on Africa Day, but every single day, that being African is our most important competitive advantage. And if you look at the wealth of the continent that we've not been able to translate into the wealth into goods and services which are feeding Africans and looking after Africans. Because what we must remember is when we're creating great brands, we are creating the revenues, we are creating jobs, and we're creating a tax base. That tax base will help to pay for the public goods that we want to create a great continent. What we need to do, we need to face neither east, neither west, as Kwame Nkrumah once said, and face forward. Put our energies into the continent, and we need to hold everybody that we put in power accountable. And we need to support African entrepreneurs to create businesses and opportunities, because that's where we are failing. That we have left our youth, who make up 70% of the continent, who are 70% of whom are under the age of 30. We have left them all helpless and don't even know what to do with themselves and their talent.
And such a great quote from Dr. Kwame Nkrumah's Last Stage of Imperialism book. We're grateful, Tebe and Yao Louisa, for joining us here on The Pulse. We need to wrap up, but before we do so, interacting with our ambassador in Dubai, Alhaji Ahmed Ramadan, has been talking about how Ghanaians in Dubai are facing and trying to work out some plans to help their daily lives comfortable. He's been indicating in this interview that since he became the ambassador to Dubai, they've been working out a plan to ensure that Ghanaians have it easier moving into the Emiratis. There's more in this interview when he spoke to my colleague Justin Osei with our sister station up at Asempa FM.
We really have gotten closer to each other. You know, we have really established some memorandum of understanding between us. We made them to understand that, you know, our people have been coming here to seek job, and then there is this kind of issue where they come in, this kind of job they are expecting, they don't really get them. You know, and that we want to step in to make sure that, you know, these things are smoothing down. So we signed an MOU on labor migration. But it has not been fully ratified back home and even here. So it is still, you know, in the pipeline.
Been a challenge.
That's right. Oh, the challenge that, you know, our parliament has not really, you know, deliberated on it to finalize it. And that they also haven't really completed their processes of finalization.
They're still in the pipeline.
So they are still in the pipeline. But we also did that of visa waiver, which was also ratified by our parliament, and they also ratified it here. But we have certain initial difficulties with the airlines when they are picking the Ghanaian, you know, to this place, not knowing that this is have been ratified, you know, it creates a little difficulty. But for now, it has been resolved. You know, people coming with diplomatic passport, they don't really need a visa. They can come in, you know, and when they arrive, you know, they can get their things through.